The jumping off point for this session is Howard Zinn's 1970 talk at the Society for American Archivists conference called The Activist Archivist and subsequently published in 1977 as Secrets, Archives, and the Public Interest. Zinn urged archivists to, quote, take the trouble to compile a whole new world of documentary material about the lives, desires, needs of ordinary people. And it's often cited by those in the field whose work includes methods to humanize the archive with a praxis of anti-racist and anti-colonialist methods. While Zinn wasn't alone in that charge, he pierced through conventional professional standards, inspiring archivists still today. Since 2020, when the world witnessed the murder of George Floyd by police and the subsequent uprisings, there's been a surge of activities by institutions to highlight obscured histories and seek ways to improve public and private archives. This session will focus on highlighting the work of humanizing the archives and ask what opportunities and challenges lie ahead. But also look at what communities and groups have already been doing on their own for years. Organizations like the Southern Asian American Digital Archive, Densho, the Japanese American Legacy Project, and the Interference Archive, which explores the relation between cultural productions and social movements. The conversation we had planned seems to most happen at professional conferences or in closed circles. This requires either membership or registration fees or an insider status. The sharing and dissemination of practices, lessons learned, challenges, and accomplishments tend to stay in those corridors. So we're here as archivists, curators, librarians, historians, researchers, teachers, activists, community members, and the curious to learn from each other about our challenges and opportunities and hopefully collect ways to move forward. So with that said, I am going to turn this over to Michael Koncewicz. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to go through, my apologies. I'm going to go through the goals of the presentation. So the goals are an open conversation between archivists, curators, librarians, historians, and researchers, community members and teachers about the process and methods, challenges and opportunities of the work we do, and identify ways we can work on, build on the work that has already been done and ways to enhance that, to bring obscured histories to light with care and intention. And then the outcomes are hopefully trying to look at how or where can we synchronize ways that inform each other's work. What are the challenges and opportunities, how to bring this to light. And then we've asked the speakers to talk on several topics that they could choose from, either discussing their own projects, the challenges they faced and how they managed through them, how humanizing the archive is transforming scholarship and the need to process hidden collections within the archives that have been ignored, how institutions can go beyond the pledge to do better to ensure they shift priorities to continue transforming who their collections reflect, support, and recruiting the staff to conduct the work. So the outline for this event today, we're going to hear from archivists and librarians for about 7 minutes each. We're then going to go do a little collective writing responding to issues raised. There's also questions that will be raised on a shared Google Doc. We'll go into breakout rooms where people can talk to each other and share aloud things that are on their mind. We'll then come back and hear from the historians. Again, do another collective writing session and breakouts. And then we'll reconvene as a group and kind of pull together some of the major threads of conversation that were happening in the breakout rooms. After the event, we'll attempt to synthesize the discussion points and share out to everyone who's registered. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Lauren Cooper, for all the work you've done for putting this event together. Thank you to Deborah and everyone at the Zinn Education Project. This is a special event. I think it's worth mentioning very quickly that this forum is a unique opportunity for archivists, historians, librarians, educators, curators, anyone who's interested in history to discuss how we engage with the archives. Our interactions in reading rooms and on Zoom and via email are too often focused on meeting our own deadlines. And as a result, we don't have enough time to examine the meaning of our work and identify where we overlap and diverge from one another in a productive manner. I want to thank you all for being here and hope this event will inspire other similar conversations that focus on the best ways to document the history of working people. It's my pleasure to introduce our first set of presenters who are emblematic of those discussions. First is Linda Garcia Merchant. She is the Public Humanities Data Librarian at the University of Houston, co-founder of Chicano por Miraza Digital Memory Collective, and the presentation Disrupting the Absent Presence. Linda?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Zinn Centennial Committee. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen? Okay, I'm good. All right. Excuse me. The title of this presentation asks us to consider what it means to disrupt our understanding of the history of the Chicano and women's movements of the 1960s and 70s by introducing an archive of photographs, documents, and ephemera that brings marginalized voices to the center of a conversation with a community of scholars, practitioners, activists, and students. With the archive at the center of that conversation as a place that Maria Cotera describes as the archive of encuentro, or encounter, that is about the cultivation of relationships to teach and mentor to build a sustainable archive. I offer the photos in this title slide as an example why this kind of conversation is important to the sustainability of archives that foreground culture and gender. The first photo is members of the Chicano Welfare Rights on the left, organization, and includes Jessie Corona, Pat Estrada, Ana Nieto Gomez, one of the foremothers of Chicano feminism, and Alicia Escalante, a pioneer in the welfare rights movement. The second photo on the left includes the members of the Census Advisory Committee on the Spanish origin population for the 1980 census. This committee, formed in 1975, lasted for 5 years and included 2 members of the Chicano caucus of the National Women's Political Caucus, Graciela Molina de Pic and from San Diego, and Ria Mojica Hammer from Chicago. The next photo is a group of University of Wisconsin-Madison students preparing to interview Leonor Rosas, a Latina with family involved in the Raza Unida Party and Brown Berets, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, for the Somos Latinas Digital History Project. The last photo on the right is of 2 students prepping documents for scanning during the Enriqueta Vasquez Digital Public History Project Field School in northern New Mexico. Now, without the context of my narrative, these photos might exist in an archival collection removed from their connections to location, movement, action, influence, and other related documents. Each of these photographs represents milestones in the history of the Chicano por Miraza Digital Memory Collective, or CPMR, both in documenting our existence as a collective and in the importance of documenting our existence and contributions to Chicano Latina history in the United States. This example of images cultivated, preserved, and published as active participants in the conversation of the archive creates opportunity for ongoing dialogue with the materials and subjects as historically and geographically situated. The Chicano por Miraza, excuse me one second while I make this do its thing. Okay. The Chicano por Miraza Digital Memory Collective is a group of historians, educators, students, researchers, archivists, and technologists dedicated to preserving imperiled Chicanx and Latinx histories of the long civil rights era. Our project begins in 2009 at the University of Michigan, where Dr. Cotera was an associate professor. In 2013, we are joined by our digital archivist, Marcos Seiferly Valencia, who, as he describes our collection process at that point, puts order to chaos. Maria and I start this project because we knew that the archival absence of Latina contributors to the contributions to the civil rights era in no way reflected the historical reality, because our mothers, Ria Mojica Hammer on the left, that's my mother, and Martha Cotera, Maria's mother, had both been instrumentally involved in Latinx politics and the women's movement, along with Alicia Escalante, Ana Nieto Gomez, and Gracia Molina de Pic, who held encyclopedias of knowledge about this era. We wanted to preserve the Chicana archive so that its knowledges were not lost. But how could we, as scholars, recover this archive and maintain its radical nature outside of the institution? The Chicano por Miraza repository is housed at the Texas Advanced Computing Center, or TAC, using a collection software called Curator, a customizable and scalable data management system. Our login-based system supports a virtual production community to collect, upload, and curate assets from anywhere in the world, working with project partners at any institution on assets protected by institutional security. Scholars, practitioners, and independent researchers work with subjects and their communities of knowledge holders to reconstruct the content and context of each asset. Our collective is a virtual community sustained by trust in the democratized methods and motivations of the original architects of this model, the women of the archive. CPMR exists because of infrastructures like TAC and technologies like Curator implemented and securely maintained. This model begs the question, without this type of institutional commitment to this kind of autonomous production, how can we assure the stability and sustainability of this work? CPMR reflects a significant history absent of infrastructure, a collective and archive operating in a continued space of precarity, relying upon a series of serendipitous moments and rascuache strategies to persevere in existing. Such was the case for the first 11 years of this project. It is only in 2020, when Dr. Curator accepts a position at the University of Texas, Austin, that CPMR gets a more permanent home with TAC and on our terms. Building this community means building networks of participants that includes both subjects and practitioners in a multidisciplinary approach to the accumulation and discourse of knowledge. These are not just networks of the content or community being collected. They include the technological needs of collections, archivists, writers, media specialists, practitioners, and infrastructure technologists that help to create and support the community. It is an approach that suggests that expects that all knowledge is equal, all knowledge has value, and all contributions are both sound and important to a collaborative production. Collaboration means understanding the importance of an ongoing, often permanent relationship with a community to the archive. Here, the scholar and institution can provide the ongoing pedagogical role of mentoring and teaching to and about the archive in the classroom, the community center, and the living room. I ask us to reimagine how this method of encuentro that disrupts knowledge production translates to our scholarship, mentorship, and produces visibility for these archives at the margins within our institutions by merging access and adaptability of technological research infrastructures. What does it mean for our future to teach from these deliverables we've helped to build that allow students, community, and faculty to be in conversation with these archives in the classroom, in the community center, and the living room? It means that in this way, we are building intergenerational collectives, not collections. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Next is Lauren Cooper, howardzinn.org digital curator with Teaching for Change and the Center for Black Digital Research Librarian and Managing Director at Penn State University. Her presentation is Humanizing Digital Scholarship, Methods, and Practice. Lauren?
Great. Thank you, Michael. Let me get my screen shared here. All right. So I'm Lauren. My pronouns are she, her. I am a Muskogee Indian of the Creek Nation, currently of Oklahoma, formerly of Georgia, and Okemo Odom of the Gila River Indian community in Arizona. Before becoming a librarian 4 years ago, I spent 20 years in publishing, both print and digital, working at social justice organizations whose missions were to amplify the voices and histories that are hidden, missing, marginalized, and silenced. I bring this experience to my work as a librarian and in how I try to center the humanity in digital work. So this is a lightning talk of a much longer talk, but it's a talk of putting principles into practice. And also as a Native American woman in a senior leadership role in a Black History Center, I'll also share about something that can be uncomfortable for many of us: having professional humility when working on projects representing people and communities that are not your own. So some background. I'm the Digital Scholarship Librarian and Managing Director for the Center for Black Digital Research. This is our team from our group meeting earlier this week. We're about 30 people, including the people on the Zoom screen in the background. We're a collaboration of faculty, grad students, undergraduates, librarians, and community members. The center houses the Colored Conventions Project, Douglas Day, and the Black Women's Organizing Archive, and you can find out more at digblack.psu.edu. So I'm going to talk about my work with the Colored Conventions Project, or CCP, which is the longest running of the three, and focuses on bringing the buried history of the Colored Conventions movement to digital life. This movement started in 1830, spanned 7 decades. It convened hundreds of state and national colored conventions across the US and in Canada to bring Black people together in order to organize and strategize for racial justice. CCP is guided by a set of principles. I'm going to speak specifically to Principle 2. We pledge to account for Black women's labor and leadership in our own historical work and in our own project practices. Principle 3, our project aims to highlight and center Black lives. And Principle 5, we seek to name Black people and communities as an affirmation of the Black humanity inherent in Black data curation. So here are some examples of putting these principles into action. The first is concerning visual representation, ensuring digital space for Black women. In 2018, a new crew of us were responsible for completing a website migration that had been in progress for 2 years. Pictured here are all of the people that worked during that time period, 2018 to 2020. In the middle are myself and the 2 new co-chairs of the website committee, Kelly Coles-Barnes, who I think is here in the audience today, a PhD candidate, and Michelle Burns, an undergrad. And we're all new in our roles, taking over the management of this project. As we prepared for launch, we noticed several design issues that did not abide by our principles. The first concern was visual representation and avoiding stereotypes. Working on the overview page for our digital exhibits, it gave me pause that for our exhibit on the colored conventions in the carceral state, we were using an image of a child chain gang. This image was troubling because it could reinforce the stereotype of Black males in prison, especially the stereotype of young Black males in prison. And if someone was scanning this page, this is the visual impression they would be left with. Not only that, but we were missing an opportunity to highlight the exhibit's actual narrative, which was the colored convention's protest against the justice systems of California and Georgia, and the Black women reformers in the 1800s who contributed to that resistance against incarceration. I raised these points to Kelly and Michelle, and we chose to feature instead portraits of Selena Sloan Butler, an education activist who is well known for her critiques and condemnation of Georgia's incarceration system, and Ethel Wilson, a woman of financial means that was demonized by the media and ultimately convicted of a crime, even though it lacked physical evidence. We then examined all the other featured images and chose ones that you might not often see of Black life in the 1800s. Dignified portraits of Black leaders, Black business owners, and Black women in a classroom, to name a few. The next is ensuring digital space for Black women. In our digital exhibits that were rich with personal biographies, namely women's biographies, they were bundled together on a single page in an effort to keep the menu structure simple. However, this caused lots of scrolling through a long page to get through and to see everyone represented, and the pages were hard to cite or make a direct link to. Kelly, Michelle, and I discussed this and decided to create separate pages for each of the women's biographies so their names would be visible on the menu navigation. This set us back a couple of weeks, but we felt it was critically important. So here are some examples where we made one page into several pages. In our end of semester report, as we accounted for our time delay, Kelly eloquently wrote that we took the extra time because consolidated pages were, quote, causing women's names, lives, and contributions to be in a bulk bin of information. Their name isn't seen in the exhibit menu and you have to dig through a page. The layout doesn't provide their lives the digital space their male counterparts may receive, or give their lived lives the oxygen and space they may have struggled for. And then in my third and final example is about listening to the core community and having humility in the work we do. The 3 of us wrote a blog series to document the behind the scenes work. It was written in chronological order, in the order that we proceeded through the work, and was to be rolled out as follows: project management, platform decisions and implementation, quality assurance, URLs and scholarly implications, parts 1 and 2, and ensuring digital space for Black women and access to Black histories. 2 African-American senior faculty members, Drs. Gabrielle Foreman and Kim Gallen, told us no way should Black women be last on the list. My immediate response was, they're not last, we have more coming. That's where it just happened to end at this moment. The narrative structure won't fit if we move it around. They followed up with, nope, you need to rearrange it. As a Black female academic, if I saw that on someone's page, it would signal to me where their priorities are and how they prioritize Black women. They were right. Despite all my experience, I missed this, and I was being defensive instead of hearing them. In self-reflection, I asked myself why I was so wedded to adhering to the timeline, true to traditional publishing standards. And this is one of the challenges of our field, the issue of professional protocols or practices deemed superior over the voices and priorities of the community being represented. Our educational, professional, and technical expertise is only one part of the work. I advocate that we use our skills to find ways that things can be done differently in different ways, to not be gatekeepers, but to be collaborators. So the blog posts, it would take some time to edit and rearrange them so they transition smoothly, but the impact, visual significance, and more than that, the mutual respect will be long lasting. Thank you. Next, we are going to head into the historian section of the presentation. The first person we're going to hear from is LaShawn D. Davis, Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University. Dr. Harris is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, 2019 to 2022, and author of Sex Workers, Psychics, and Numbers Runners, Black Women in New York's Underground Economy by University of Illinois Press.
Thank you, Lauren, Michael, Shannon, and my co-panelists for organizing and participating on this panel on such an important subject. I hope that archivists and historians will continue to have conversations about our respective work and talk about the different ways to address issues in the archive, as well as ways to collaborate. My research interests include urban working class Black women's history, their labor lives, interior lives as wives, mothers, lovers, and pleasure seekers, their grief and loss, their dreams and thoughts about economic stability and racial uplift and respectability, and the different ways they navigated and contested various forms of race, gender, and class exclusion, as well as intra-racial tensions. And in the vein of scholar and historian and activist Howard Zinn, my research and approach to writing history is, quote, I'm going to write about what I think is important, the social struggles of people, the class structure in the United States, the racial progress or the racial problem, and the problem of sexuality inequality in the country, end quote. Like Zinn, those are things and subjects that guide my research. I plan on talking a little bit about my research experience writing my first book, which is entitled Sex Workers, Psychics, and Number Runners, Black Women in New York City's Underground Economy. And also some of this is relevant to the current thing that I'm doing now, which is on Black women's activism and experiences with the police during the 1980s in New York City. Exploring the lives, labor aspiration, and worlds created by urban working class Black women was and continues for me to be an exciting, challenging, and frustrating endeavor. Concerns and even fears about the dearth of primary documentation on women profiled in my work made at times the thought of archival researching really daunting. As I began recovering and piecing together surviving documents on urban women, I encountered several archival issues. The scarcity and even unavailability of primary material complicated initiatives to excavate women's family backgrounds, labor patterns, and physical journeys throughout one of the nation's most fascinating cities, New York. Textual absences and voids illuminated the many limits of the archive, which historian Marisa Fuentes and other scholars of Black women's experiences describe as a fraught space for marginalized bodies. In her seminal essay, which came out in 1987 in the Journal of American History, the essay by Deborah Gray White, which is entitled Mining the Forgotten: Manuscript Sources for Black Women's History, White rightfully points out that part of the difficulties in excavating Black women's lives and bringing their stories to the center of historical inquiry is the archive itself. White comments that Black women's worlds, quote unquote, have been peripheral to those most likely to keep records of any kind, thus making Black women's voices and stories scarce within manuscript collections. Considered unworthy of scholarly exploration and excluded from historical archives, women of color, especially those that lack privilege and power, have remained on the fringes of history. In their edited volume, which is entitled Contesting Archives: Finding Women in the Sources, scholars including Sherry Katz, Mary Elizabeth Perry, Callie Gross, and others attribute Black women's missing, lost, or destroyed primary documentation to, quote, the lack of archival objectivity and disinterested institutions that house historical documents and artifacts. Historian Ashley Farmer, in a 2018 Modern American History Journal article, also rightfully asserts, quote, recent histories are raising methodological questions and concerns. How should historians conceptualize the archive? What can be discerned from traditional and non-traditional sources? How do scholars interpret and account for the power dynamic that the archive reproduces? And how should this dynamic inform historical inquiry and methodology, end quote. Upon locating rare archival documentation on working class Black women's personal and private worlds, which included contradictory, fragmented, and missing biographical sketches and labor accounts, I was reminded of the difficulties of tracing, understanding, and analyzing early 20th century Black women's non-linear footsteps. At the same time, and as one scholar rightfully noted, exploring such quote unquote contradictions, silences, and collisions in the documents presents an opportunity for scholars to, number one, read and interpret historical figures' silences and pose new questions about those subjects. Two, engage in various forms of informed historical speculation. Three, employ an interdisciplinary lens or approach. And for me, that means using the work of 20th century poets, novelists, musicians, and other writers such as Claude McKay, Roy Ottley, Ann Petrie, Toni Morrison, and even soul singers Marvin Gaye and Rick James. Number four, having ongoing conversations with my partners in the struggle in documenting lesser known histories, and that includes archivists and historians about such challenges. Some of these informal conversations over coffee and lunch included advice on other collections that would be useful to my work, as well as archivists disclosing the limitations of their institutions, the challenges and politics of archival collecting, especially in a moment of COVID, and how historians and archivists should continue to engage in such dialogues, and also connecting me with other scholars who are doing similar work. And five, as Ashley Farmer reminds us and recommends, that historians and archivists should make a commitment to doing more with less. And she was really talking about historians. If we can commit to doing more with less, we can produce histories that reveal the narratives and the voices of a diverse group of understudied community of workers and activists whose lives were complex and characterized by victimization and agency, and the constant struggle to live out their freedom dreams. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that presentation. Next is Michael Koncewicz. Michael is the Nash Archivist and Ewen Center Program Coordinator at Tamiment-Wagner Collections, New York University, and is also the author of They Said No to Nixon: Republicans Who Stood Up to the President's Abuses of Power by the University of California Press. Over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. And once again, thank you all for being here today. As a historian who has worked as a curator at the Tenement Library and Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives, a renowned archive that has documented the history of labor on the left for 120 years. I've had, quite a bit of time to think about a lot of these issues. But our collections are truly, they're special. From the letters of garment workers from the early 20th century to the posters that were held by Occupy Wall Street activists in Zuccotti Park in 2011, our archive spans a wide range of progressive and radical social movements that have fought for a better world. That, of course, includes the Howard Zinn papers, a collection that officially opened to researchers during my very first year at Tamiment in 2014. Our archive's origins go back to the Rand School of Social Science, a political education center that was started by the members of the Socialist Party of America in 1906. Based in New York City, the Rand School accumulated a sizable archive that covered early 20th century New York City labor activism and certain socialist organizations. NYU acquired what eventually came to be known as the Tamiment Library in 1963 and added on the Robert F. Wagner Labor Archive Project in the 1970s, a more concerted effort to document the history of New York's trade union movement with help from the New York City Central Labor Council. My colleagues and I are fortunate to be surrounded by these materials and the stories of working people that they capture. Tamiment's collecting has helped preserve the stories of countless radical activists, movements, and organizations. Working within the archive, I'm also reminded of the importance of a repository's institutional history in making sure that all of our community is aware of that history. That goes for using archives in the classroom, our collecting policies, and our curatorial decisions, namely what we pick to process and showcase in our exhibitions. Despite the impressive work that my predecessors and my colleagues have done over the last few decades to diversify our collections, our archive is still heavily white and disproportionately male. That is also a part of Tamiment's story, as is the case with many other similar archives and political institutions. Recently, my colleagues and I have incorporated that part of our institutional history into our classes, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it improves their research experience. It helps explain why certain search terms don't yield as many significant results in our finding aids. This often comes up when students ask about what we have related to Black radicalism from the 1960s and 70s. We have materials that are useful for their research, but I encourage them to think about our archive's history when wondering why we only have printed ephemera, why we only have a few flyers and newspapers for organization that they are interested in. Recently, Tamiment's head curator, Shannon O'Neill, who is very sad to miss out on this event, she and I have done extensive work over the last few years to sort through our massive backlog of unprocessed collections, plotting out the next several years of processing with our colleagues at NYU Library's Archival Collections Management. Keeping the library's ongoing IDBEA initiative at the forefront of our decision-making, we have prioritized dozens of partially or wholly unprocessed collections that will be made available to all of our researchers in the coming years. These include unprocessed collections that have been sitting in storage for years, or collections that have had AV items that were not included in initial processing, that were not deemed to be as important as other EV collections that were processed. Some require additional descriptive work or rehousing in order to give researchers more information and in order to preserve these valuable materials. So that has been a key part of our work over the last few years. Collecting is a key part of our jobs. It's the one that most people associate with our jobs. While we've been limited by the ongoing pandemic, we've initiated a COVID-19 web archiving project that captures the recent history of numerous New York City-based mutual aid, labor, and other related organizations. I saw earlier in the chat, Nicole Greenhouse, the library's web archivist, who I want to shout out. Thank you, Nicole, for all of your work and helping us with this project. We were happy to receive permission, just to bring one example of the type of activists and organizations that we reached out to back in 2020. We were happy to receive permission from Christian Smalls in the spring of 2020 when we asked to archive his social media. But there are dozens of other examples that you can see in the link that should be dropped in the chat. We have also resumed our more traditional collecting over the last several months after pressing pause in 2020 and 2021, again, paying attention to gaps within our holdings when making a decision on materials, planning an oral history project, or mapping out a future exhibit. The conversations that we've had with our community of donors is one of the best parts of my position. As a historian who mostly worked with government documents in my early research, my first instinct is to prioritize openness, collecting and access. But as a curator, it's become clear to me that radicalizing an archive often relies on the hidden work that happens behind the scenes. I just mentioned one example, how we have worked through our backlog to try to prioritize more diverse collections within our holdings. Aside from the work with our backlog, my colleagues, including Shannon O'Neill, have participated in reparative description work with our finding aids, identifying outdated and/or harmful terms in our descriptions. Other archives are doing similar work, particularly over the last 2 years, as part of a broader effort to diversify their repositories. It's a small step, but we feel it's a significant one that should lead to better access to a more comprehensive history of the left. Given the events of the last few years, we feel that it's a concrete step towards diversifying Tamiment's collections. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Michael. Up next, we have Nancy Raquel Maribel. She is Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland. Dr. Maribel is author of Suspect Freedoms, The Racial and Sexual Politics of Cubanidad in New York, 1823 to 1957 by New York University Press, and co-editor of Keywords for Latino Studies by New York University Press, 2018. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to be here. I am so excited to, well, first of all, thank you to Lauren Cooper and to Deborah Menkart for inviting me. And I am so excited to be in dialogue with my colleagues. And actually, it is so rare that historians can have a conversation with archivists. And so this is a wonderful opportunity to have that conversation. I have to say that there was so much that I want to say because we rarely have these conversations. And so what I decided to do is really talk about why I do the work that I do and really what I've learned along the way and how we can make changes in the future. And I have to say that as I was listening to everyone, I think what really marks my work is that I do a history, what Michel Rolfe-Trouillot calls an unthinkable history. It is a history that never really existed. I didn't have sources or archives to look up when I was writing about Afro-Cuban migrants in 19th century New York. They simply weren't there. And so my research, I became fascinated with writing and thinking about, and oftentimes even creating archives of Afro-Latinx diasporic communities in New York, but I've also done research in Florida and other places in the United States. And I think, yes, and I think for me, the key book that I continued to look to was Michel Rolfe-Trouillot's Silencing the Past. Because as a Haitian anthropologist who really looks at the history of not only the Haitian Revolution, but also the Alamo, he tells us early on to be careful of the sources and to understand that silences in the archives are often deliberate, that they are made to, that those silences are not just haphazard, that narratives, especially traditional narratives, mean something and have a function within a society, oftentimes in support of the nation state. And that is also lessons that Hayden White and Foucault and so forth always tell us as well. So with that in mind, I felt that a lot of my work is one that at the same time that I'm using sources, I'm often critical of those sources. I'm also thinking about these sources that in many ways are precarious, and to use my colleague's, Dr. Harris's term, fraught, is that we have to wonder why these histories and the archives are there in the first place. So as I was doing my research, I always tell folks that I actually started doing my work through oral histories. because the narrative that we have, for instance, of Cubans in the United States is a very fixed narrative. It is one of 1959, it is of a privileged exile, and it is of a privileged white exile. That was a story that did not fit my experience. It did not fit the experience of my family. And so oftentimes I tell scholars who are working, your story and the story of your community matters. It can also be a part in a way of how you do research. And so that was the beginning of why I did the work that I did, because I knew from my experiences, from the communities I knew, that our histories were there and they were not necessarily being discussed or part of the archive or didn't exist. And so as I began to do this research, I have to thank the incredible archivist, Diana Lachantaner, at the Schomburg, as well as Miriam Jimenez Roman, who were my incredible mentors, who helped me to conceive of what this project could possibly look like. And so they gave me the name of a Afro-Cuban woman who was an activist, an organizer, who came to New York in the 1930s. And it was through her and her experiences that I could tell this history that had not ever been told or ever been written about. And what did I learn is that I had to be almost just willing to use anything at my disposal, whether it's newspapers, photographs, stories. I looked at musicians, the Afro-Cuban musicians who were excluded from performing in places like the Palladium would perform in the Afro-Cuban clubs that I write about, poets, writers, anything at my disposal, I looked at. I was incredibly promiscuous when it came to sources and archives, because you never know where you're going to find sources. And I'll give you an example. As I was doing my research, I was looking at the New York Times. That's where you first start, right? The New York Times. And I remember there was a small little write-up of something called the Cuban Anti-Slavery Society. It was an anti-slavery society that was set up in 1872 by African-American men in New York. It was 4 sentences. And it was those 4 sentences that took me onto a journey through and through, whether it was then, the Congress, Library of Congress, the National Archives. And what I was able to find through these 3 or 4 sentences was an incredible story of African-American men in 1872 looking to include this idea of Pan-Africanism and so forth through the Cuban Anti-Slavery Society. And that was a moment of organizing. Then as I began to do more research, I became, I would say, curious and fascinated by the gaps and the silences. Oftentimes the history of Cubans in the 19th century ended in 1901 with the end of the Spanish-American War and US occupation of the island. But these people didn't just stop. They didn't stop living, they didn't stop ending. So what happened after 1901? And what we realized is that we're a massive migration of Afro-Cubans coming to New York in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, which is why you see a rise of so many Afro-Cubans in music or in sports and so forth. And that got me thinking, like, why don't we write about their lives as labor organizers, as people who worked, who lived, who were married, so forth. It was only as performance and how we look at the Black body as performance. And so that got me thinking that there was a different history to tell. And I tell you these stories because there's a way that I love the title of this panel, which is Radicalizing the Archive, the radicalizing as a verb, as something that we can look at and change and challenge and pull apart and bring in, because that's how we tell these histories that I often think were not meant to be told. And the reason that I say that is that when I began to do a work that was pre-59, that centered Afro-Cubans, that really looked at the history of a Black Afro-Cuban woman as the authority, as the narrator, that challenges a completely different narration of histories that we were told were ours and were never ours to begin with. So I think that I'll end there. But what I'd like to add is, as my colleague, Dr. Harris said, I will give you some of the ways that I also look at source. And for me, is the most important thing with source is to have, as you look at, have an idea of what you're looking for. And oftentimes archivists will say, well, what are you looking for? We don't know. It's often messy. We're trying to figure things out. But it's important to be curious, to really know what you're looking at, and to not be afraid of speculation. I think Dr. Harris is absolutely right with that. Think of what you could possibly find, what could possibly be out there, and try to make those connections. Also understand to navigate the silences. Just because something is not in the archive doesn't mean it didn't happen, doesn't mean that it's not valuable. Look at something else that will allow you to then go somewhere else, and that somewhere else will take you somewhere else. My research took close to 20 years to write this book. There was a reason for that, but it meant that I needed to look at sources that were in different languages, that came from a different country, that looked at different archives. They were not always in the major archives. It could be in the smaller archives, and I was willing to do that. Also, the interdisciplinary analysis is key. Look at poems, look at stories. I'll end with this. There was one book that I thought was really incredible. It was a book in the Schomburg, and it's called Figuras y Figuritas by Teófilo Domínguez, who was an Afro-Cuban activist who lived in New York. And what he did was he published a book in 1899, right after the Spanish-American War, of different stories of Afro-Cuban men. He included their photographs. And what he was doing was that he was building archive. He was creating what I call a future historical archive. He understood that his experience and his histories of his community would eventually be erased. They understood white supremacy. They understood how it worked. And so he created source that it was his attempt to say, we existed and here we are. So with that, I think I have my time, and I just want to thank everybody.
All right, thank you. Thank you to all our panelists in this session. A lot to think about and reflect on, and hopefully map out ways that we might move forward with these challenges. We want to leave some time to open it up and have discussions. All the panelists were meeting in our own breakout room, and I wanted to kick it off with asking the historians a question of like, what is something that surprised you or you didn't realize you had to account for and navigate around? I'm gonna kick it off by saying I was just at Tamiment this summer, and both Shannon and Mike worked with me and were very generous with their time and very patient. And I was able to get 8 boxes a day out. And so I was calculating 4 days, that's 32 boxes. And I was trying to make a plan. My project is to prototype a DIY process to creating item level catalogs of archival materials. So it's like, great, 48 boxes. Let's see what we can do. Even with a full-time research assistant with me doing this item level cataloging, I think we got through 3 or 3.5 boxes of materials. So our eyes, our stomach, our eyes are bigger than our stomach are bigger than eyes. But that's just something I like had to do a reality check. And so now when I go back in winter, I have a better idea of like what's really involved and having the patience for it. But I'm going to open it up to the other panelists if they have something to share about how they've dealt with things they didn't anticipate working in the archives.
Okay, I'll go. I think what you said was important. So for me now, it's about going in and not expecting to do research like right away as soon as I get in there at 9:15, but actually talking to the archivist and the staff and understanding the space and the protocols of that space, because each archival space is very different. Another thing that's important to me is to go in, if I haven't already emailed the archivist, is to tell them, have maybe if there's time, I have a small sit down about what I'm working on and what I think I need. That's important for me because I'm going to be in that space for who knows, 3 years, 4 years, maybe even 10 years, right? And I want them to know exactly at that moment, like what I'm doing and how my project could possibly evolve. That way they can possibly direct me towards archival collections that I hadn't even thought of, because I'm focused on one particular archival collection, but there may be other archival collections that speak to what I need. And I think the third thing for me is to kind of start small and slow. I know that sometimes when you go into the archive, there's limited time, at least for some of us, but to kind of start off small. So, one box one box is a lot, or one box may be a lot. So for me, it's about starting small, getting to know the space, and talking to the people who manage that space, because I want them to know exactly what I might do. And just in case a new archival collection comes in, they can send me an email and say, hey, we got this in, you might be interested, or there's another historian, or there's another space that you might want to consult.
Thank you. Anybody else want to jump in on that question?
Sure, I can jump in. So I think to add is I actually have a Tamiment story, and it allows us to kind of think about the archives. So when I was doing research in the 1920s and 30s, about 1932, there was an organization called El Club Julio Antonio Mella, which was organized in New York, and it was named after one of the founders of the Communist Party in Cuba. And I thought, wait a second, how they organized an organization. And so I did a lot of research, and then I found out that it was part of the IWO. And so I then went to the Tamiment libraries and realized that this was one of many of the immigrant lodges, what they used to call logias, with the IWO. And I think what was interesting is that I went to the Tamiment is that oftentimes when you do research, realize that the librarians and the archivists might not know what you know. And so I would come in with my specific sense of knowledge and be like, oh, you must have information on this. And the person I was working with was like, we've never really heard of them. So it's important to understand that they're dealing with this amount of knowledge base, and you're coming in with sometimes with your specific questions. But that's why I think it's good to have this conversation, because once I had a conversation, showed the sources that I had found, be able to have explain why I felt it was important, then the librarian was incredibly helpful. And one of the things that I realized was that there is a lot of, I don't know if it's cross-fertilization, but I realized that this club, which is so important and valuable, and maybe the Tamiment could build up a little bit more of that club, is actually at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. They ended up having an enormous amount of information with the sources. And a lot of it had to do with, because the founder of that logia, and this name will be familiar to Michael, was Jesus Colon, who was a Puerto Rican activist of the 1920s and 30s. And so the story, you go like, okay, Jesus Colon is going to take me here, and then this is going to go over here, and so forth. But yeah, that was kind of the stories. Number one is to be flexible. Number two, have these conversations. And the third that I would say is really, for me, looking at the source once was never enough. I would look at the source, and then I would do research, I would write, and then I would come back to the source. And it was almost like I was seeing a different source, because what you come with, and to be conscious of what you come with, is so key. So it's almost like layers. When you first look at a source, you're going to think about it a certain way. And then you're going to write and research, look at other sources, build up, make those connections. And then when you come back, you'll look at it a different way. So I would recommend to continue to look at those same sources. Don't think that you're ever finished, because you're not. And so, and it will tell you, it would even add, it will become much more richer and complicated as you approach those sources later on down the line.
Just to
Go ahead.
just to piggyback off of that, one of the things we always teach our students working on the project in the classroom, wherever we're engaging with the work, is to have that conversation with those documents, is to look at them and understand why why they are living documents. Why were they produced? When were they produced? How they were produced? Who produced them? I mean, all the elements that combine to create, the reason that document exists. The other thing we have them, look at are all of the additional information on a newspaper page. Why was that page kept? What else is going on, especially with and this happens not just in Chicana por Mirdasa, but the U.S. Latino Digital Humanities Center, MAS 1848, which is a project out of UNM. We're always talking to students about engaging with the material in that way, to say, what else do you see on this page? What else do you see in this leaf, in this program? What other information is it telling you? And why? Exactly. Who saves what and why?
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to touch on something that's come up in the discussions and that also came up in our pre-planning meeting, is the issue of money and funding and how this work gets done. And maybe I want to ask Michael and Linda to speak to it. Michael can talk about it from an institutional level, and then Linda as a researcher. And I'll just note that I took a trip to Tamiment that I've always been wanting to take to do this item level cataloging for years. And I was only able to do it this year until thankfully my mentor, Ben Goldman here at Penn State, recommended me, I write this grant. I had 2 days, I whipped it out and I got it. And that is what allowed me to make 2 trips to Tamiment. So without that, I'd be trying to figure it out. So I'm going to turn it over to maybe Linda to build on the kind of like researcher going in and what it takes to get there. And then Mike about the back end at Tamiment.
So in my talk, I talk about the fact that for 11 years we didn't have funding, right? And that we couldn't get funding. And one of the reasons we couldn't get funding is because the institution had no inclination to accommodate us in any kind of way that made us visible. And so, being at Michigan was no benefit to us and was a detriment because we could never get in any kind of institute. We've never done this project with any kind of funding. And so, and I say that to say that we exist because we were just determined to exist with opportunities in building relationships in order to get what we have. That's now shifted, but up until that point, I also want to clarify about student labor. All of the students that actually worked on this were compensated in some way, either in doing this through coursework or getting a grade and getting that kind of experience, or working with us through institutional grants that students can get through, I think it's UROP at Michigan. And so we were, I'm sorry, can you go ahead? There's something going on here.
Sure, I can jump in, if that's okay, Lauren. Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that a lot of my friends from graduate school are historians, and I think they rely on year-to-year gigs. They often, I think, just assume that archives and libraries are just more stable, and I guess they are compared to academia. But they're mostly unaware of the fact that an increasing number of positions within archives and libraries are contingent. They're reliant on much of our work is relied on adjunct labor, grant funded positions, not entirely, but it's the case, and we're not alone. And that's always going to be an obstacle to when we're trying to plan out the future, when we're trying to complete ambitious curatorial projects. And it's something I think the public that our community is increasingly becoming aware of, but the broader public I think is not aware of.
Thank you. I'll just sort of tie that up with one point we had when we're talking amongst the facility presenters, is the idea of when folks have the opportunity to negotiate their positions, particularly in academia, bringing other people through the door with them. So I'd seen on Twitter recently how a librarian was negotiating her position, and she negotiated to have her 2 colleagues get a new position that had a pay raise attached to it, right? So just thinking about the different ways we can, again, sort of the mutual aid of it. How can we all work together to strengthen the labor that's behind it. And I think another great example of that is with my faculty director, Dr. Gabrielle Foreman. She's negotiated for funding. So we have our undergraduate researchers who get paid $15 an hour. Our graduate researchers get paid $20 an hour. And if they're chair of a committee, they get $25 an hour. And that's to pay equity, but also to lessen the burden of debt or to get, another side job to help pay for school. So we are at time. I thank everyone so much for their thoughts and their energy and their contributions. As I noted, we're going to try to go through the notes and synthesize some of these points and share that out to folks, and hopeful that will give you ideas of ways to navigate, things to consider, how to move forward, and maybe have these kind of conversations at your own institution or communities.
I'm going to take the liberty of jumping in and asking people to unmute themselves and shout out Lauren Cooper, Michael Koncewicz, the Tamiment team, all the fabulous presenters, and our ESL interpreters, Crystal Butler and Rodney Leon, who jumped in here. You can unmute and shout out your thank yous.
Thank you
Wonderful
so
session.
much. Great.
Incredibly important.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Inspirational.
Thank you.
Very inspirational.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I want to meet again.
Absolutely.